Hey buds, socialism done left here for socialism done long. Today I'll be expanding a little bit on my library socialism episode. I felt that a critical shortcoming of both the Seriously Wrong podcast, which inspired the idea, and the short video which I had to introduce it, was that neither of them could discuss concrete examples of library socialism. How exactly can you explain why a policy is better if you don't have examples to point to? In particular, policies that aren't just a small group of people who all know each other sharing things, which is more akin to like ancient communism, but something more of a policy that a city enacts or an enormous corporation, which we can expand on for a model for a socialist society of millions of people, strangers, all of whom still find a way to share these goods as collective ownership. So to that end, I looked a little bit into car sharing, which to me seemed like something that'd be relatively difficult to do in a sharing context. You know, cars are complicated machinery, they require a lot of upkeep, and so on. And so I was interested in approaches to car sharing and what some of the ups and downs of them are. So the first thing that I thought was interesting is that the USSR appears to have been one of the first countries to seriously move towards car sharing. Now, the USSR's program on car sharing was an utter failure for several reasons. I think this Financial Times article is actually pretty revealing. They note that several of the critical problems with the car sharing program were that there weren't enough cars, obviously. In the Soviet Union, there just weren't enough cars and more general consumer goods because of constant shortages. The Soviet Union continued to promise its people to have Western standards of living despite having the income of like a second world or third world country. So it just couldn't meet up with demand. But more than that, there was a particular idiocy of the car sharing program that Khrushchev implemented where you'd rent out a car, and if it got into an accident, you'd have to pay the full cost of the accident. There was no insurance whatsoever. So that's absurd. Like, if you wouldn't want to rent a car, if you could be sitting at a red light, some guy rams into you from behind, and now you've got to pay $20,000 to repair the vehicle. And what's more, during the time that you had the vehicle, right, while it was in the shop, you'd have to pay as if you were renting the car for that entire time. So it might not just be $20,000, it might be like $25,000 or $30,000, a significant expense, which is already adding on to the cost of this program, which you'd have to rent a car for. So, to me, obviously this program was a failure. There weren't enough cars. They were low-quality Soviet cars. And if you did rent a car, you're taking on enormous risk. This is not the kind of thing that the average person would want to take on in this situation. The Financial Times, of course, isn't exactly a reliable source, but I do think that a book called The Socialist Car, Automobility in the Eastern Bloc provides a little bit more context and a little bit more detail on this. Some of the tables that I thought were particularly revealing about this issue were the ones that Louis Siegelbaum provides in his introduction. First, private car density in the Eastern Bloc countries, cars per 1,000 people. This one shows, to my mind, two things. First is that you can see the rapid expansion of number of private cars in all of these countries, which means that there was an expansion of cars overall, that these countries were able, at some level, to keep producing things that they felt were essential for their people. In Bulgaria, we have from 19.2 cars per 1,000 to 137 cars per 1,000 over the course of 20 years, which is a quintupling. In Czechoslovakia, we went from 55 to 2,000, a quintupling. In the GDR, we went from 66 to 232, a quadrupling. Hungary, 18 to 136, over a sextupling. Poland, 15 to 136, another quintuple. Romania, we don't have the data for. USSR, another quintuple. In fact, Yugoslavia, the one example of the market socialist country which had the greatest integration with Western powers, saw the smallest increase from 35.7 to 135.1, which is the smallest increase ratio of any of these countries, with the possible exception of Romania, where we don't have data. So the first conclusion is that, yes, the socialist economies of the Eastern Bloc were largely able to increase their automotive production. This is especially clear when we compare it with American car statistics. For example, the Soviet Union started about 6 cars per capita, or in America, which is something like 1905, 1907 or so. And by 1989, just 20 years later, they were talking about having 50 cars per capita, which over here is also about 10, 15 years later. This is more clear if we look at the more developed Eastern Bloc countries like Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, the GDR, and so on, where they started at around 20 cars per capita in Bulgaria, which on this map would end up being around here, where India was in 2004, and over in 1989, just 20 years later, they're over here. They're getting about 136 cars. This follows more or less the development of most of the countries that are discussed in this sample. India in 2004, India 2014, except that Bulgaria achieved this much more rapidly. They moved from where America was in 1913 or so to where America was in 1920 or so, much faster than many of these contemporary examples of development. So to me, this suggests obviously that central planning was not a total failure. Even in the authoritarian state systems, the highly corrupt, the highly inefficient, the terribly planned, the barely socialist, the highly inequitable systems of the Eastern Bloc, they were still able to deliver things like this. But perhaps more importantly, this is private car density. To be fair, these are actually just vehicles, not even just cars, and not even just private cars, but just all vehicles. So maybe this isn't a fair comparison. But private car density increases suggest that this was a failure of the Soviet Union to promote collective car ownership and of the Eastern Bloc to promote collective car ownership. We can see this even more clearly in another table later in this piece. This one's looking at the Central Committee of Hungary and the transport they use to get around. So the Central Committee is obviously an elite group. They're going to want to tend to favor cars. But the Central Committee knew this was obviously like an ideological problem. Why should the elite get cars while the poor have to use buses? So they really, really tried to crack down on cars. They had like numerous policies. They had numerous meetings. They tried to like incentivize the use of collective cars. They tried to like report on people doing this. They tried to shame those people. And as you can see in this data, none of it worked. First, we have column A, which is the cost of car use, where they're just using a standard rate of 2 florins per kilometer. And then they're using collective car transportation costs in thousands of florins, which is the B column. So the B column is everything like buses, trains, and so on. So you'd expect, proper communist official, they get up in the morning, they get on the train, they go to work. Instead, 4.4% of the costs of transportation that that the Central Committee, actually spend. Where are these collective transportation costs? The vast majority, 95%, were to car use. And despite all of these policies, it went down over time. It was a slight increase in 1962, but overall we saw a trend from maybe 5%, 4% or so, down to 3%, 2%. This was a failure of policy. Not only was, even among their most dedicated adherents, the Central Committee unable to promote this policy, they were unable to promote it as this discusses among the general populace. People wanted private cars, and I think that's partly because that's what they'd been promised by the central government. They'd been promised Western consumption standards. They'd been promised the freedom and individuality of the car. Even if, as Khrushchev himself noted, this was a highly inefficient use of the car is not being used most of the time. It's simply just not a most efficient use of resources. In fact, one of the other programs that Khrushchev promoted was the idea of a micro-district, which was his solution to the enormous housing crisis that the Soviet Union was having after World War II, when huge amounts of Soviet housing was destroyed, about half or so. So the microdistrict and the linear city, which you see depicted here, were paired concepts. The linear city idea is that you'd have a residential district over here, you'd have kind of transitionary districts over here, and you'd have heavy industry and agricultural districts over here. So people would live in the city, where you'd have parks, where you'd have a whole bunch of the other things that people need to live, like clinics and education centers and so on, so that all people could share in the benefits of urban life and the benefits of having really, really nice places to live. But they wouldn't face all the problems of pollution, of noise, of traffic, and so on. These would be centered out further away from the city. But because everyone would be along this line, you'd have an extremely strong transit. People would hop into the train, they'd go to work, they'd finish, and they'd come on back. So this is an attractive idea to most planners in most models, but it was only really able that in the Soviet Union, where all the land was nationalized, that they were able to implement these kind of designs. Paired with that is the micro-district. Instead of having each of these be like a city block or something, the way you might have in New York or London, where you just kind of have a hodgepodge of buildings thrown in as necessary, these would be planned districts. The numbers here aren't very useful for understanding what's going on, but the basic conception of this is that you'd have residential buildings like these here, surrounded by all the buildings that people need in a daily basis. You'd have clinics, you'd have an elementary school, you'd have a high school, you'd have the transportation to go to work, you'd have parks, you'd have dental care, and on and on and on. Anything that you need in your daily life, or perhaps even your weekly life, would be available within walking distance. The only reason that you need to use the roads would be to go to work or to go to vacation. And so this eliminates the very need for a car. You don't need to car share if there's no need for the car in the first place. Now, these to me are extremely attractive ideas of Soviet planning. The linear city is one which is equitable. Instead of pollution tending to be, instead of having, as we see in capitalist cities, pollution tending to be concentrated near the poorest areas, the people who are most marginalized, getting the most pollution, the most harmful effects of industry. This would be an equitable distribution, and it would be a minimized distribution. Not only would it be that the poorest among us would have better lives, but everyone would have better lives because there would be less pollution, there'd be less destruction of our daily lives, and everyone would be able to take in the benefits of city planning. One of the particular contrasts that these kind of designers drew is with greenbelt designs, where you'd have like a central city and then a green belt surrounding it, which a lot of cities, like I think Baltimore is pursuing this, New York's pursuing this, and so on. I think London also did pursue this. It tends to be that if you're on the outskirts of the city, then you can be the one to go to the park. But if you're on the inside of the city, you ain't going to the park. It's like an hour or 2 hours away. It's a huge expensive time. So this is equitable, but it's also better for everyone. The poorest and everyone would be better off in this society. But as I noted, car sharing was a failure. Not only were the elites unable to resist the impulse to getting cars so that they could benefit their privileged status, but the people themselves wanted private cars. There was no effective car sharing program in the Eastern Bloc. Instead, we can look to more modern examples of car sharing as successes. So I've pulled up a few studies which examine North American car sharing programs, so the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the effect that they have on people's daily lives. So, for example, this one from Access Magazines found that across a number of car sharing studies, after car sharing, the number of vehicles per household dropped from 0.47 to 0.24, which is almost a 50% reduction, which is just absurd. This would imply that if the average person had 2 cars, they now have 1 afterwards. And much of this involves people losing cars that they already had, despite apparently preferring this lifestyle to what they had before. They had the car, they knew how much benefit it could provide them, and yet after trying car sharing, they realized how much more preferable it was. And this isn't the only benefit. There's less cars, which means that you don't need to produce as many cars. If instead of producing 2 cars, now you're only producing 1, this is a huge reduction in production costs, a huge reduction in the number of workforce you need to spend making cars, and now these people can work on other things. So this is hugely important, not only in the direct benefits of having less cars in the city, less traffic jams and so on, but it's beneficial in that perspective. It's also beneficial from the perspective of mileage, because people buy cars that tend to be cheap. They want cars that, not necessarily get the greatest mileage, but that are best for their pocketbook. In contrast, for cars that are in continual usage, one of these studies demonstrates that car sharing tends to increase the usage of a car almost 10 times, right? This would imply that the average car is only being used, 10% of its full capacity. You want an efficient car. You don't want to be spending a lot of money on fuel costs. So there's a huge average increase in greenhouse gas efficiency, in carbon emission efficiency. Just to quote what I thought was a really powerful line from the end of the car. When we consider the vehicles potentially not purchased, in addition to those shed, we estimate that every car-sharing vehicle removes between 9 and 13 other vehicles from the road. This is mind-boggling to me. This would imply that a full shift to car-sharing could potentially reduce production of cars not just by 50%, but by all these indirect things added up to over 90%. We can see a similar result in this study, which did more or less the same thing. They did a meta-analysis of a huge number of surveys and empirical analyses based on car sharing, and they found that 15 to 32% of car sharing members sold their personal vehicles, which is lining up with this one over here said, where about 80% of production was due to people who own cars selling them, and between 71 and 25% of members avoided an auto purchase due to car sharing. So this is a huge reduction in number of autos. Due to car sharing membership, average monthly transportation costs also decreased, ranging from $154 to $435 for American members and $392 to $492 Canadian dollars for Canadian members. Which, this is also a reminder, efficiency matters. When transportation is efficient, it benefits everyone. You don't need to spend as much money on cars, but you also don't need to spend as much money on all the other things related to cars, like all the time you spend on traffic jams, all the fuel, and on and on and on. This isn't even accounting for the reduced pollution and potential health benefits. They also note there's side benefits, where people who car share tend to do other things. For example, a lot more, 13 to 54%, take public transit more frequently, which seems odd. Like, if you have access to car sharing, why would you take public transit? Well, it's because you tend to use car sharing for things that don't work for public transit, but now because you don't have a car, you will use public transit because you realize all the things that it can be used for. This is a nice hybrid solution, in my mind. To bring it back to what I think was most important, in the United States, the average car sharing member's VMT divided by VKT, which is like an overall measure of car usage, is reduced between 7.6 and 79.8%. They say that this wide range is likely due to location-specific variations as well as differences in member use and survey design. Based upon all member surveys, the authors calculate a 44% average VMT/VKT reduction per car-sharing user. So while this isn't quite the 90% reduction that this study provided down in its prior paragraphs, a 44% reduction does align with the number that I gave up top, where you might see a reduction from 0.47 to 0.24 vehicles per household. A 50% reduction in car usage is extremely beneficial. Again, at worst, this means that you're producing one less car for every 2 cars. 50% less car production means so much more production that could go to other things, so many fewer workers who have to spend their lives on this. So this to me is obviously beneficial. If we want to look to an even more extreme model, this would be the model the International Transportation Forum looked at in Lisbon, where they imagined that they replaced literally all cars with shared taxis, where you'd have something like one person driving the car and 5 seats that you could get in and just going around the city. So kind of like buses, but a little bit more variable because you could tell the person to go exactly where. So they estimate that Lisbon's congestion wouldn't exist anymore. There just wouldn't be. You'd be able to freely move at full speed. Traffic emissions were reduced by 1/3, which is a huge reduction of pollution. 95% less space was required for public parking, and the necessary car fleet was just 3% of the current size of today's fleet. That's a reduction of 97%. This resulted in total vehicle kilometers falling and GHG emissions by 62% falling. So if this study is even like remotely correct, this suggests a huge benefit to either proper car sharing in the sense of, parking a car and people checking it out in the library socialism model, or in the model of having basically the elimination of private car ownership and moving entirely towards a large taxi model. So just looking at this, I'm amazed by the benefits of car sharing. Like I don't know if you can quite hear, but my jaw has been open this entire time. I'm just astounded. And to me, this suggests just the power of more collective modes of ownership. Everyone doesn't need to have their own car. They don't need to have something that they don't use most of the time. And this has benefits beyond just, I don't have the freedom to drive wherever I want at any given time. It results in no congestion. You get where you want to go faster. It results in cleaner cities. It results in less global warming. All of these things that benefit us all. So I guess all this is just to say, the car sharing programs that the Soviet Union adopted weren't successful. The more capitalist models that we've seen in the present are entirely successful, which suggests to me that the problem doesn't seem to be car sharing, it seems to be management. So if we simply nationalize these car programs, it's entirely feasible to me that we could achieve a even more equitable car sharing program, an even more wide-reaching car sharing program that would truly achieve these utterly insane benefits in terms of health, in terms of the environment, in terms of congestion, in terms of city planning, and so on. So, in short, library socialism, it's good. Car sharing, it's really fucking good. This is Socialism Done Left. Have a nice evening.